Okay, so before we begin this video, it's important to note that there is no right or wrong way to build solutions. It's about what is right for your solution. So what I'm going to demonstrate within this video requires some prerequisites. You have to have some basic knowledge of databases, why they need record IDs, how to create relationships. I'm using FileMaker to demonstrate these techniques. However, it could really apply to pretty much any database platform, a relational database platform. So let's talk about field naming. You may have a contacts table with fields in there called last name, first name, title, whatnot. These are all great field names. However, it may be actually a lot easier if you were to order these fields in a particular way so that you can either sort them or find them easily. Now, in this example here, if we were to try and isolate just those fields that are required for a person's name, we're going to have a hard time finding them. You're going to have to try and sort it or search on it in some way that we can find it easily. So what would be a good practice is to rename them in such a way that they can sort of be grouped together. For example, name last. And for this example, I'm using camel case. It really doesn't matter which method you use, as long as you're consistent and as long as when you actually can sort them by alphabetical order, they all group together. So we're looking at last name, first name, title. These are all name-specific fields. The other fields like special code and notes and things like that, they're not really related to the contact at all. Even though they're in the same table, they're not really part of the name. So let's go into each field and name them specifically in those groups of name so that we can sort it alphabetically and it would actually appear in a list all grouped together. As you can see now, the other thing I like to do in renaming fields like this, yeah, camel case is okay, but sometimes an underscore makes it a little bit more readable. So we can add an underscore between those, make it a little bit neater, a little bit easier to actually see the individual fields, so you can identify them quickly and easily. So let's just rename those now. As I said, this is all sort of FileMaker technique, but you can really apply the same kind of methodology to any database which allows you to create fields, which is pretty much all of them. So we've got now a grouped set of fields and we can then sort those alphabetically and that then becomes grouped. So you can see all the name fields together and all the other extraneous fields can be called whatever you like. And you can create your own groups for sets of different fields, whichever they apply to. It really depends on what your solution contains. Now obviously if you're using FileMaker, it automatically puts that field name onto the layout. We can easily rename the actual title without renaming the field itself, so you can just make it a bit more user-friendly rather than having these ugly underscores and name last, whatnot. You can actually just rename them. And I'd imagine most platforms have something similar where you can just rename them on the actual layout. This really becomes helpful when you're looking at a table with lots and lots of fields in it. Also when you're importing and exporting data, when you go to export data from a table and you can sort them alphabetically, it makes it so much easier to grab the fields you want and export them. And I'll show you that in a minute. So obviously when you're designing the interface, you probably want to put them in the correct order. We're just going to rearrange these on the layout so you can see what I'm talking about. So you want to put them in the actual order that they should appear. Perhaps my title should be at the top, but let's just have a look at the tab order, make sure they're actually tabbing in the right order for now. And obviously this is not a pretty layout. We want to make it a bit more presentable to the end user, but it's just giving you an idea of how it might sort of be arranged and what it might look like at the end product. So let's show you an example of what it might be useful for. For example, exporting data. just going to export tab delimited, tab separated text and save that to the desktop. You can see now it's all grouping, so it makes it really easy to then select those fields. Boop, 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 boop. Just clear that out. I'm going to shift select on the Mac. I think it's Control on Windows, but you'll have similar mechanisms for pretty much most platforms. We can select those fields, export them. It's very easy because they're all grouped together. Yeah, just makes your life a lot easier. Okay, I'm going to talk about field separation now, because I've actually seen this existing in the real world and it disturbs me greatly. I've seen, for example, an address field which has got pretty much a full address in it, and that is such bad practice. This particular customer had an address field with everything in it, and they said, oh, okay, I want to export it to a website so people can search by suburb and postcode, and it was a mess. You could spend a lot of time and effort separating all these individual components out into separate fields, but the right way to do it is to design it correctly from the get-go. So you really want to separate fields out. For example, with an address, you want postcode, state, postcode is also known as zip code in America, state or region, street name, street number. You can do all that kind of stuff separately. Now, that is a much better way to do it, and it might sound really obvious to a lot of people, but as I said, I've actually seen this in the real world where somebody designed it this way and it was just a tragic mess. They had to redo the whole database. So separating them out is probably the first step, and if you were in a position where you actually had to fix the data up, yes, there are some tricks in FileMaker that you could do to separate those individual components out and populate these fields, but to be safe, you'd probably want to re-enter the data into the appropriate fields separately. Keep the original data there until you're finished with it, so you can refer to it, make sure you've got all the data correct. And this is how really all databases should be. Separate the fields down to the granular level as much as you can. This will help you in a lot of different ways. There could be labels that you might want to print out that might not need a suburb or state. There might be other areas that you need all of the address, and then you can just combine them together on a layout to print out or whatever. There's no limit to what you can do in terms of putting the fields together. There is a limit, though, in being able to separate these fields out if they haven't been designed correctly in the first place, as you can see in that. Now, the other thing I'd like to point out here is I've put field names like street name, street number. I think it's better to actually have something a bit more generic. Addresses all around the world vary greatly, so I think it would be best to name them something like address line 1 or address line 2 and so on, whatnot. I just think it's a bit more generic and a bit more universal, because there are just so many different variations in different countries. You might even have things like building names, levels on a building, things like that, where you want to give as many possible variations, and it doesn't necessarily have to be strictly a field that says street name or street number. It can be just address 1. For the most cases, 90% of your data will probably be consistently entered that way anyway. And even if it isn't, you can put labels on a layout to illustrate this is where you put the street name or the street number or the building name. But behind the scenes within FileMaker itself, if you've got the fields just named address 1, address 2, address 3, that should be in the order in which they appear on a label or on an address that you're going to be presenting on a layout somewhere. So it's more generic, it's more flexible. You don't have to be fixed and concrete with these things, because if you then later design this to be used in a different location and their structures of addresses are completely different, you're going to get all muddled in your head. You're not sure which goes where. So if you've just got address 1, address 2, so on and so on, Maybe we'll just do the underscore here as well to make it a bit more readable. It just means it's a lot more generic, and it's a little bit easier to sort of follow that flow. Again, with my field naming here, I'm going to be putting the name address before these particular fields. It may seem a little bit redundant because it's in a table called address anyway, but what's the harm in actually being a bit verbose, adding those particular prefixes to the fields? It's not such a bad thing. You may have those instances where those fields are being used somewhere else, importing, exporting, whatever it might be. You don't necessarily always know which table it's coming from, so it's good to know within the field name what those fields are for. Yes, they belong to the address table, but you might as well name them address whatever. In a lot of cases, for example, you might also have a database of addresses that has a physical address and a mailing address for the one record. So that's another thing to keep in mind when you're naming these fields. You may have two sets within the one record, and you want to be able to identify them easily when you're looking through the field names. So this is probably a preferred method to name those fields. Again, when you're displaying that data onto a layout, you can call it whatever you want, but behind the scenes, having this generic fixed structure is probably a better way to do it. So this is actually something that is specific to FileMaker, but I see it a lot and it bugs me. When you enter Find mode, you may find yourself having a bunch of navigation buttons across the screen, and if you're in Find mode and you click on it, you'll find yourself in a different place, on a different layout, but you're still in Find mode. So it's very confusing for a user. They don't know what to do. They may be able to navigate back again, but it is not an ideal situation, and it's such an easy fix to actually eliminate that possibility of clicking that button. And in FileMaker, it's a very simple layout change that you can apply. So let's go and do that now. What you need to do is enter layout mode. So we're going to go into layout mode. And the keyboard shortcut for layout mode on the Mac is Command L, on the Windows it's Control L, but you can select it from the menu as well. Once you're in layout mode, you click on the button which you normally navigate with, and if you want to hide it in Find mode, it's a very simple process. Just click on it, you get the information on the actual field itself, which the shortcut is Command I or Control I on Windows. And if you select hide object when and type in there get window mode equals 1, make sure you select apply in Find mode, save that on the layout, and next time you go into Find mode, let's just stretch out this window so we can see it a little bit better. So we're going to go into Find mode again. Again, the keyboard shortcut on the Windows is Control F for Find, on a Mac it's Command F. Now when we go into Find mode, the button is disappeared. Much better user experience because they're not going to be able to navigate out to a place where they shouldn't be anyway. And away you go. That's a simple fix. Okay, so what we're going to talk about is something a little bit more advanced. If you have a look at something like a contacts table, we want to create different ways of communicating with customers. For example, we can add a whole bunch of new fields for email, phone number, Skype address. There could be a whole bunch of different fields that you could create here. Rather than creating multiple fields to accommodate multiple different ways to communicate with people, it may be better to create a whole new table, and I often call it just a comms. So we can create a comms table, and then you can relate that table back to the contact record. So let's create that table in this system here. It's just an example. I'm going to create a new table called comms. We're going to create a field to relate back to the contact record. We're going to create a field to store the type of communication record, for example, phone or email, and then the actual details, for example, the phone number or the email address. Let's put that in here now. So So we need to create the field to relate back to the actual contact. And you will probably find most relational databases will be a very similar design and methodology, and you can use this same approach with pretty much any relational database system. So back in the contact table, we need to create the individual record ID field, which I believe now FileMaker sort of does all this stuff for you when you create new solutions, but I like to do it my own way with my own methods. So for my purpose, I'm just going to use the serial number. Some new FileMakers actually use a record ID, UUID I believe it is. So I'm going to create the relationship between the record ID and the contact in the comms table. Now, FileMaker gives you all sorts of options when you create that relationship to allow additional records via that relationship and deleting the related comms when you delete the contact record. I am going to display that on the FileMaker layout in a portal, so you can sort of display that for an end user to enter the data. But I'm also going to explain how to sort of use a number of different relationships to sort of single out those individual comms types. So first I'm just going to create that relationship to the comms table, so you can actually see how to enter the data and how it may work for you or for the end user in a much more flexible way than having all sorts of different fields. And this methodology can be used in a number of different types of tables, types of relationships. It really is, you know, like I said at the beginning of this video, it's whatever suits the solution best. I tend to create this kind of technique because I often develop solutions for customers in very different types of industries and very different ways of communicating with customers. So this one allows you flexibility in being able to sort of accommodate all sorts of different types of data. So we need the field type and details in the comms table, and you'll see how I'm going to use that in the portal on the actual contact record. It helps if I put the fields into the portal. So let me just do that again. If anyone here is new to FileMaker Pro, obviously you can see FileMaker Pro actually makes relationship creation very easy, and manipulating things like portals and the layout very easy as well. So I'm going to put the type and the details onto a contact record, and you'll see there the actual portal ready to put entry into. Now I've gone and made a boo-boo because I haven't actually created the contact record yet. So you can't put related data into a record that doesn't exist. So let me just put in a name in here just so I can create that record. And then what you can do in here is simply type in the type and some details of what the actual value is. Obviously I should really put some field titles at the top of this portal so I can see what field is for what purpose. But you get the idea. You can put in infinite number of types of communication methods. Now that's obviously more flexible for a lot of purposes, a lot of applications. The only downside here is we need to sort of be smart if we want to have a bunch of contact details, and let's say we just wanted to show the email or the phone in a separate field on this layout, make it easy to refer to. What we would need to do is actually create a relationship between the contact and the comms using a field which is going to be a calculation of text, and that text will match the type in the actual comms record. So let's do that now so you can see what I'm talking about. So we're going to create a relationship very much like what we did between the contact and the comms. But before we do that, I need to create the field which I'm going to use for the additional criteria for that relationship. For example, I'm creating one here called email. This is just going to be a calculation result of text, which is a literal quote unquote email. Let me just pop that in there now. Bonk, into text. And the reason for that is because I don't just want a relationship between the contacts and the comms. I want to have it create a relationship that shows me just the email value. So I'm going to just copy this relationship, for example. I'm going to rename that relationship to something meaningful. For example, comms filtered by email. Now I just use these little squiggly characters. You can do whatever you like as long as it's meaningful and not going to break a system. So I'm going to create that relationship between the IDs and then add an additional criteria here that says, okay, let's match our new field, which is email. Just going to click on that. And that has to match the type. That is a secondary criteria to the relationship. So those two things have to match. And in doing so, I'm going to now be able to show the actual email address via that relationship onto the contact record anywhere I like on that layout as a separate field, because I've got a new relationship and it's going to just filter by that particular thing. It's a bit of an advanced technique, and I'm assuming you probably do the same with a lot of other database systems, but you get the idea. It's more about designing for purpose, yeah. The pros and cons, you know, if you find it's a bit too hard to get your head around creating tables, you might want to just create fields. If that's easier for you, that's great. But if you're developing a software package, which the general public's going to use, you might want to have that separate table. The advantage of having that separate table, if we have a look into the actual comms table, let's go and have a look at some of those fields there. Now, obviously, we've got the type and the details of what the comms are. You can also then use this table to display the related person's name or whatever it might be. The advantage of having that comms table now is that you can go via that table and you can use it for example, bulk emailing or whatever it might be. So you can actually search by the type, single out all the different emails, and use the related contact names in your bulk emails or whatever it might be. So I'm just going to put that on a layout now so you can see what I'm talking about. So here we are in the comms table. We can actually see who the person is and all their contact details individually. So you can single out different types just by doing a search. Bring out all the email addresses, bulk email, or do whatever you want from this table. So it has a bit more functionality and use in terms of being able to go to the bottom of the bucket and then run it from there. And again, it is really designing for the usage. Yes, you could do a lot of this stuff from the contact record itself and find those things that way. But having separate tables like this has many advantages. So the last thing on the list, but perhaps the most important thing, is designing a system according to the business process. Let's use my system here as an example. We've got a sales area, for example. We're not actually able to create new records within the sale area. There's no button or keyboard shortcut to do that. It's got all the other buttons specific to sales there, but you're not actually able to create a new sale record. And the reason for that is because we really want to drive that from the contacts area. So what we normally do is search for a particular customer, see if they're in the database. If they're not, you can create a new record, That way you're sort of verifying data as you go. So you search for a particular contact first, and it will bring up the details so you can actually double check, make sure everything's okay. Then you've got a button there to create a new sale record. So it's following a process, it's following a flow of how customers do their business, and that is often a better way and a better approach. So in a different area of this particular system, for example, if we have a look at something like the purchases, we've got records in here, and we can actually create a new purchase record from here and then link it to a contact record. Why? Because the majority of our suppliers of products are already entered into the database. We don't need to create new records. We don't normally need to verify all their details. We know we've already got that in the system, so it will step you through a different process, even though they're very similar things. So it will allow us to find a contact record and link it and bring it back to the purchase record, simply by selecting your contact. Once you've done a search, it will grab the contact details, link it to the purchase record, ask you a few questions that are important to the actual purchase, and then step you to the next part, which is returning you back to the new record. So it's all about that process flow and what those requirements are for that particular task that the customer's doing. They're going to be driving the business. They want to do the right thing at the right time and drive it the right way. So then you're ready to go with the new record. You can put in all the details you want. And that is it for the video today. Thank you so much for watching. If you've got any comments, feel free. And feel free to visit my website, firebirdit.com.au. Thank you.